So today I have the privilege of talking about how opioids affect the way the brain interprets pain. And the objectives, as Davey mentioned, there is actually a role for pain in survival. And we'll talk about that today. We'll also think about how pain is interpreted. We'll talk about opioids and how is that different from opiates. And we'll look at the therapeutic effects as well as significant risks of improper use of opioid and opiate medications. So just to let you know, pain is considered to be an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage. And this is a very well-crafted definition from the International Association for the Study of Pain, a body of pain researchers. And so notice that the definition says that there could be actual as well as potential tissue damage. So the question is pain beneficial? Okay, to answer that, let's get back to this. When there's actual tissue damage, you want to know that there is something going on and you want to address it. And so in that way, there's some use for pain. However, when there's no actual damage going on and there's just the sensation of pain, then pain has outlived its usefulness. And that's actually the difference between acute pain, which is actual tissue damage going on, and chronic pain, when there's actually nothing harming the tissues, but there's still the sensation of pain. So is pain beneficial? What do you think? True or false?
True.
Very good. Pain can be beneficial. And here's an example. This is, these are people, 3 different individuals, and there were only 40 that we know of in the entire literature who have a condition in which they don't feel pain. And this is a very good illustration that acute pain is beneficial because it confers survival benefits. In other words, see the little girl on the bottom? You can see that she has bitten her top lip. And some kids, like the guy to the upper left of her, they actually bite and mutilate their lips. And they also not only bite their fingernails, but they can actually self-amputate because they don't feel pain. And, you know, people have these very rare disorders. It's called congenital insensitivity to pain. And they often don't sweat either because the small fibers of the nerves that convey the pain message are affected, and sweating is also used. The function of sweating uses small nerve fibers as well. And so people who have congenital analgesia or insensitivity to pain, they cannot experience pain. And so they, without intending to mutilate themselves or harm themselves, they harm and mutilate themselves. And these are people that have normal intelligence. And because they do not feel pain, they don't know that they need to not do something. They've been known to experience trauma from jumping from heights, and very few survive to reproduce, which is why the genetic disorder is very rare, and only 40 in the literature. I mean, they don't feel pain. It's very sad. And so that kind of leads to any questions. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. And so this leads to this slide, which is how is pain interpreted? And unfortunately, it's very complex, but there are many different inputs that can give you pain. I don't know, can you see my cursor? So you have temperature that can be translated to pain, especially like if it's really icy cold or burning hot. Mechanical stress can cause pain, and there are local effects like inflammation, if the cell gets ruptured, if there's a parasite penetrating, or if you have abnormal hormonal activities. And so all these types of nerve endings, which are out here, there's a cell body in either the dorsal root ganglion, which is a part close to the spinal cord, or in the sympathetic postganglionic neuron. And so it just means it's a relay station. So there's a cell here, and then it relays to the spinal cord, and then it travels up into the brain, and then into a part of the brain called the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, it reaches the cortex where pain is experienced. And so anything, if it's hypersensitized, can cause pain. So when things are hypersensitized, things that would just feel warm to a person who doesn't have hypersensitization will feel burning hot. And for somebody who doesn't have hypersensitization, you can touch their skin and it just feels like pressure. But to somebody with, say, complex regional pain syndrome, the very same stimulus can be experienced as pain. And so forth. So all these nerve endings can cause pain if they become hypersensitized. Now, you do have normal nerve endings that are supposed to convey pain, and there are chemicals called neurotransmitters that that activate electricity in these nerves, and then the electricity goes to the spinal cord, and then there's another signal, another chemical, another neurotransmitter that goes from the nerve in the outside here to the spinal cord nerve, and then that sends another electrical signal to the brain, and then when it gets to the cortex, that's when you experience pain. So it's unfortunately pretty complex, but the main idea is that you have regular pain receptors in the body that tell that there's pain going on. But then if you have hypersensitization, anything can cause pain, even movement, even sweat glands, even blood vessels can cause pain. All right. So let's go on to the next slide. So here we have, on the left, we have a summary of what goes on. You have a pain source, for instance, a tendon here, the triceps tendon gets strained. It sends a pain message through the nerves, and then it enters the spinal cord at C7, which is just a level where the triceps tendon is. And it goes up to the thalamus and then to the cortex. And your brain interprets this message as pain in the left triceps tendon of so much intensity, probably severe the way that he's responding. And you can see whether it's burning, aching, or stinging. Now, after the brain gives that message, you know that you've got to do something about it. So you could either rub it, you can put some If it's from an injury or a wound, you can apply first aid to it. And if it's something more severe, let's say there's the tendon actually breaks, then you know that you're going to make an appointment to see a doctor and maybe get some surgery. So the brain now knows that you've addressed the problem. And then the next thing the brain does is it sends a signal, okay, to the pituitary, and the pituitary gland, which is the master hormone gland, produces a hormone called endorphin, and it blocks the pain signals. And the word endorphin means the morphine that comes from within. And we call them endogenous opioids. The word opioid only means something that is that will reduce pain, like opium. So it just means opium-like. Okay, and endogenous just means something that is made inside the body, as opposed to exogenous opioids, which are usually medications. Now, here's part of a very complex molecule, and this molecule is endorphin. And this is the part that goes into the nerve cell and cools down the pain. So, and there are actually several types of endogenous opioids. Endorphin is just one of several, about a dozen. And these chemicals reduce pain, and they're produced in the pituitary gland. And it goes to all parts of the pain sensing mechanism, including the nerves, the tendons, the muscles, the bones. The other thing about endorphins is it can produce pleasure. And people who get a runner's high, for instance, that's from endorphins produced by exercising for a long time. Now, since we are talking about opioids, and there was a question that was raised, what's the difference between opiate and opioid? So opium comes from a flower, and here's a picture of Papaver somniferum, and this flower is called the opium poppy, and it's the source of one of the ancient and modern world's most widely used drugs. Okay, now if you extract the alkaloids inside this plant, you get three things: morphine, codeine, and thebaine. And these three are derived from opium, and so they're called opiates. So opiates are substances that come from opium, and so we have natural opiates like morphine, codeine, and thebaine. Now, you can do chemical operations on morphine and codeine, and for instance, you can get illegal drugs like heroin, and they're extremely more addictive than morphine, for instance. And heroin is what we call a derivative of the natural opiate. And so if it comes from opiate, whether it's directly from the flower itself, or if it's chemically derived from that, from these chemicals, we call those opiates. It just means that it comes from opium. Okay. Now, opioid includes, so all opiates are opioids, but not all opioids are opiates. So these act like opium, and so they're all opioid. And so natural opioids are all opiates, as well as semi-synthetic, like heroin, hydrocodone, oxycodone. They're all from these molecules here. Now, the ones that are completely synthetic, like fentanyl, like meperidine, methadone, and tramadol, these are entirely synthetic. You don't get them from morphine or codeine. Okay, so those are completely synthetic, and they're not opiates because they're not from the opium poppy, but they are opioids because they act just like they act as if they are from opiates. And the reason they all act that way is because they share a shape, and that's like a key. The chemical shape is similar to this key in endorphins. Any questions about how opioids work? The chemical shape is similar, even though they may be totally different in the way they're made.
Wong,
Yes.
there is a question in the chat, and it
Ah,
says, are there some areas of the body that are more prone to pain than other areas?
yes. If there are a lot of nerve endings, such as parts of the face, inside the mouth, for instance, there's a lot of nerve endings, you're going to have a lot more pain. Whereas, like if you look at certain parts of the skin, like the palms of the hand, they're not as many, and so certain areas have more nerve endings than others, and so they can have more pain. Good question. So opioids and opiates, they work on many places in the brain and nervous system. And they have all sorts of huge side effects as well. So the desired effects of opioids come from activating these endorphin receptors, also called mu receptors. Mu meaning the Greek letter for M, where morphine comes from. So they achieve these desirable effects, such as pain reduction in short-term use. And you can get short-term pain relief over a wide range of doses. This may not be so desirable, but you also get the feeling of pleasure. And I say it may not be so desirable because sometimes that's what gets people addicted to opioids. They get this feeling of pleasure, and with heroin, it could be intense pleasure, especially at the first use. But the second use, you get something called tolerance, and it stops working so well. And sometimes you have to, well, people who get addicted, they have to use, in order to just feel as normal as you and I, people who are not addicted to heroin, for instance, they have to use heroin just to get to that point because of the tolerance and dependence that occur with use. The third thing that opioids do is to help with sleep. And so the undesired effects of opiates, there are two types. There are nuisance effects, and then there are severe effects, which can severely impact your role in society. So the nuisance effects are things like if you overdose, you get pinpoint pupils. You also get withdrawals with dilated pupils. There's itching. There's spasms and pain with urination. And then when you do use the restroom, you don't feel that you've emptied. There's dependence, which means that you get so tolerant to the effects that you got to have it. You got to have more of it. And there's also constipation, weight gain, erectile dysfunction, and sweating. So those are nuisance effects. And then severe effects, some people would put erectile dysfunction under here too. It depends on, their situation. But there's addiction, which obviously can lead to increased crime and delinquency and other social evils. Prostitution is often, and human trafficking is often tied together with opioid addiction, because that's the way they try to control their victims, getting them addicted to opioids and other substances. Slowed breathing, even to the point of stopping breathing altogether, impaired judgment, increased pain with chronic use. And this is something called opioid-induced hyperalgesia when it gets very extreme. Immune system fails. You can get respiratory arrest, and then death can result. In fact, in 1 year, recent year, there were over 80,000 American lives dead due to overdose. Sleep deprivation. So I'm going to just talk about a few of these severe side effects. So this is a depiction of the sleep cycle. We have non-rapid eye movement sleep, of which there are, sometimes they say 3, sometimes they say 4. And then you have also rapid eye movement sleep. So basically, you want to get more of the deeper sleep, and then you want to get into rapid eye movement, because that's where cellular repair and restoration and the elimination of toxins occur. If you don't get enough sleep, you feel sluggish, your brain doesn't start, brain stops working right, and all that is due to the lack of REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. Now, with occasional light use of opioids, you can get sleep. But the problem with using opioids in a chronic way, you can reduce the deep sleep and you get more of the non-restful stage 2 sleep, which is not that helpful. Any questions about sleep and opioid use? So when you use opioids chronically, you get disrupted sleep, and then you get chronic fatigue as well. Any questions about sleep deprivation with chronic use? All right. Let's talk about the immune system, because as you know, especially with the pandemic going on, the immune system is a hugely important system. So here you see natural killer cells, which take care of viruses and cancers, cytotoxic T cells, which help, again, with viruses and bacteria, as well as helper T cells. These cells here are part of the skin's defense mechanism. Macrophages are found throughout the body, different parts of the body. So these are all immune cells. And these immune cells are all affected by chronic opioid use. And studies show that people who use opioids chronically, they have reduced natural and adaptive immunity, as well as the immunity conferred by vaccines. Okay, so in other words, vaccines don't work as well. Your ability to fight off infections and cancers go down, and then you get reduced resistance to cancers and infections from chronic opioid use. Any questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
So once you stop taking opioids, does your body recover?
Yes.
And it can go back to you can get those immunity properties back and all?
Yes.
Good. Okay.
Yeah. You're welcome, Davy. So opioid-induced hyperalgesia is a phenomenon that was actually seen as early as the 1880s, just very quickly after, after the opium wars. Wars have been fought over opium and opioids and opiates. But studies show that, and this phenomenon has been studied ongoing since, and study after study shows that with chronic use of all opioids except for natural endorphins, which your body makes, especially when you exercise, especially when you get plenty of sleep and the right kind of nutrition. All other opioids, you have increased sensitivity to pain, which means that even things that don't usually cause pain will hurt. And the things that usually cause pain cause way more pain than they really should. And so chronic pain, opioid use in the long run produces increased pain because you get reduced pain relief, you get irritation of supporting cells of the brain called glial cells. And so the brain has increased hypersensitivity. You also have increased hypersensitivity in your spinal cord as well as the nerves. And so all that leads to increased pain. And the amazing thing is that when you stop using opioids, sure, you go through the withdrawal, which can be very painful. But when a person who has this, they can't seem to get any pain relief, what they need to do is stop using opioids with the help of a physician, because it could be deadly to do it without proper monitoring. Then they feel certainly no worse and often way better than they did before they developed the opioid-induced hyperalgesia. So any questions about opioid-induced hyperalgesia? So in summary, pain does have a beneficial role. If you have an injury, you need to protect yourself from further harm, and pain motivates you to find a remedy, and so that's a really, really important thing and a good function of pain. We learned how the brain interprets pain, and we see that we have natural ways to fight pain, and the best way to fight pain is with endorphins, right? It will help reduce pain, and there are short-term benefits of opioids, especially like right after surgery, you need opioids to fight the pain, but it's not meant to be something that you need on a long-term basis, because there are significant risks of chronic opioid use. Certainly there are exceptions, like if a person's dying of cancer, I don't think anyone would say, don't give them strong, opioids. And certainly there are situations with AIDS patients, I prescribe strong opioids. Especially if they're gonna die, they're about to die, they have cancer. There's nothing else that we can do sometimes. But when we're talking about chronic non-malignant pain, in other words, this pain is not going to kill you, using opioids might kill you. So we have to find other ways to manage pain, and that's what next month we'll be talking about. What are some other ways to manage pain, other medications, as well as alternative and complementary therapies.